Appreciate everyone's time today. I tried to think of probably the two most representative things of sort of the new ways we're trying to use Streetlight to leverage lack of data and leverage the small bits of data we might have available to help with planning studies, help with development review, and really corridor studies has been a big breakthrough in assignment of trip generation. We have a study in a somewhat rural area. This is north of the city of Lexington at the interchange with 11 and I-64. So this is an area where we have a lot of different uses going on in little pockets. So there's some labels on here. We, for instance, have a high school on here. We have the Virginia Military Institute just to the south in the city of Lexington. We also have various pockets of little shopping centers and hotels, and then a larger shopping center with a Walmart and a Lowe's up the top right. Pedestrian facilities are really limited with just a couple of sidewalks and some spot areas where we have pedestrians we know moving between clusters of activity on either side of US 11, which is a 4-lane divided road. So you can see, a pretty high ADT, almost 20,000 ADT on the south end here. So no pedestrian crossings at the traffic signals or anything. So this is a study done by the Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission to help support Rockbridge County in identifying where pedestrian facilities should be targeted to help provide accommodations for these folks. So, one of the issues is there are pedestrians out there, but it's not like going into a downtown core where you can just see pedestrians all the time and you can do a semi-representative count within a day or two. The demand really fluctuates out here is what we found. And so we needed a tool that could provide us an averaging of data over a longer period of time. We just don't have the staff resources to go out and sit out there for a week and monitor. So we came up with using the Streetlight pedestrian metrics that could provide us a long period of time to sort of average out so that we could get a better idea of the activity over a long period of time and seasonal variation, but also why people were using walking within this area. What were the needs? Is it non-home based, going between activity centers, or are they people walking to their jobs? And also, since we have all these little pockets of potential places where people could cross, we need to know what the origin destination demand was between these different areas so that we could sort of gauge where to prioritize facilities. So what you're seeing here are several zones. I think there are probably 12 of them to break out the different pockets of activity. So each one typically has either the high school, and we have a jail to the left. We've got Virginia Horse Center on the north side with a neighborhood. We got another neighborhood to the right of that, the Walmart Super Center, and then various other pockets, each of which has a hotel, some fast food restaurant, a gas station, or whatnot. So we broke it out into all of these zones and then ran an OD analysis, again with the Streetlight pedestrian tool. I know this is small. You aren't meant to read everything here, but basically what's up there in the top left is an OD matrix, so an origin destination matrix to and from all of the zones, and we ran it both ways, looking at all the zones as origins and all the zones as destinations, and used the Streetlight visualization tool to put together this matrix quite easily. Just to look at the percentage of traffic of pedestrians going between each one of the zones. The actual output from this is the pedestrian index, which doesn't tell you actually how many pedestrians are there. It's better to generalize and use this as just a percentage to get distributions and compare relative flows between origins and destinations. So we used this and found out found out some interesting trends. If you look here on the bottom right, is a map put together to show these percentages at each section of the corridor. You can see going from 30% up to 55% or so. And what that is if you aggregate all of the trips, the origin destination trips between these to and from these zones, and then figure out what percentage of all overall trips are using each segment along US 11 there, you get these percentages. So basically, you can see spots where 55% are on there. That's where 55% of all our trips for all the ODs were using that segment. So that's really valuable information, right? That's not something we could really easily figure out without a large data set and without the ability to track these trips between all these origins and destinations. So we can see here that we need to focus on areas on either side of the interchange. The section between the interchange is helpful, but not quite as important as focusing on making sure people can access sections between the really larger developments, the neighborhood on the north side, and then on the south side between the existing sidewalk and gas station, a set of hotels. So this turned out to be very helpful. The majority of trips here are non-home based, meaning that NHB, meaning folks are not starting at their home. They're traveling from either a transient destination like the hotel and going to a shopping center, or chaining trips between other activities outside the home. And then we have about 30% of trips were home-based other, so going to some activity, and only 8% were home-based work, so folks who are actually commuting. So what we can tell from this is most of our trips here, if we look on the circle on the right, that pie chart, the majority of the trips are pretty short, which lines up with what you'd expect for pedestrian trips. Pedestrians aren't typically willing to go more than quarter mile, half mile for a walk, particularly in areas where driving is very common and there's ample parking. So interestingly, though, we found over 25%, over a quarter of our pedestrian sample here was traveling 1 to 2 miles to get somewhere. So it tells us there really is an expectation, hope that they can either get to their job, get somewhere they need to go, and they really want to do it by walking. And that there's also some recreational activity going on out here, which we later learned from our stakeholder group was indeed the case, that the Virginia Military Institute was having running groups come through the area on certain sections of our study area. So that was being bore out in the data here. So this is sort of the outcome of our study. This is an example of a sort of summary sheet of one of the project recommendations. But what we ended up doing, instead of using the specific percent distributions, is we tried to generalize a little bit more, again, recognizing we had a small sample size of pedestrians, and we broke it out into tiers of demand. So tier 1, 2, and 3, breaking out each 1/3, like the top 1/3, middle 1/3, bottom 1/3 of overall pedestrian demand, and then use that in a prioritization system the CSPDC put together that's based on the active trans prioritization tool. So looking at a lot of different metrics, like as you can see here down at the bottom, characteristics of the corridor, existing conditions that might contribute to the benefit of a sidewalk being present there, and then the demand being a critical piece of that. So this I feel like helped our prioritization process and helped us understand the study area much better. But lessons learned, it's again important to generalize the information. Don't take the index at the face value. Try and use the outputs in terms of relative flows between origins and destinations, and also use a long period. So we used April through October of 2018 to 2019 for this, so excluded times when schools were likely out of session or the weather was colder, to try and get a sample within typical periods when people would be most likely to walk, was the idea. There's only one way to get to most places, and that was by taking Route 11. So that's why we generalized on roads where we knew we had a funneling effect, where folks had to use that route. It's more difficult when you go up into a neighborhood area, like origins and destinations between the neighborhood behind the Walmart shopping center. You can see up here this big white box in the top here of this image, top middle. So folks coming from a neighborhood, they might be going, walking through the back of the shopping center, through the side. We can't get to that level of specificity. But for the trips that we knew we're having to use Route 11, or having to use one of these secondary feeder routes on either side of the interchange to access their destination, that's where we focused on getting our, one, that's where our recommendations for facilities were located, but also that's where we could most easily feel confident in aggregating our data for pedestrian demand. Yeah, worn paths are tricky because most folks are walking in wide shoulders here, wide shoulders next to high speed 45, 50 mile an hour traffic. So we weren't really able to, follow those kind of cow paths like you might be able to on an area without shoulders. Because it was more important for us from the get-go to understand what specific origins and destinations people were using, so that we could understand where are people coming to and from. Are folks traveling all the way from the city of Lexington to come up to a shopping center, or is it that they are making those long trips that we'd have to then chain the sidewalk along those trips? I could get demand at different sections, but it's not going to tell me, are people traversing that whole route in one trip, or are they just using, a small section? So yeah, this helped us kind of get both pieces of information at once. So I don't know how many of you have been involved in traffic impact analysis. So this is when you have a land development and they're going to generate a certain amount of traffic associated with this future site, and you have to make assumptions as to how many trips they're going to generate, how are they going to get distributed on the road network, and then how are you going to assign them on the road network. So this is something we do in VDOT quite a bit to help understand and help our localities specifically and their planning commissions and councils and boards understand the impact of traffic associated with the development, so they can make a decision as to whether or not they want to approve a rezoning, and also identify what mitigation might be performed by the developer to kind of help deal with that additional traffic. So coming up with the assumptions for trip generation, well, there's a big book for that, but coming up with how you distribute those trips in the network is pretty squishy. It's usually just kind of guesswork where, I can't tell you how many meetings I've sat in where we're all just kind of sitting around like, well, should that be 40% or 60%? Like, I think people like to go that route. You can get on a travel demand model and maybe get some idea of how your distributions work in an area, but the travel demand model aggregates large areas that might have a mix of land uses into one large traffic analysis zone. So what we really need is more granularity and also land use specific information. So we also use trip distribution when we're doing planning studies. So we need to figure out what future development is coming up and how we're going to assign that onto our network. If we're not just doing a straight line growth, we need more higher level of detail to understand what specific facilities are going to be impacted. We basically go through a pretty similar exercise as a TIA to go and build that information into our study. So, as I say here, it's often pretty subjective. So the example I have today is from a corridor study that's underway right now outside of the city of Harrisonburg. This is on US 33 between the city of Harrisonburg and town of Elkton. It is part of the arterial management program. And we're trying to look at the year 2040. And it's, you have a lot of speculation going out that far. We don't have our travel demand model for the MPO area doesn't cover all of the study area. So we worked with local planners to come up with assumptions for what we can reasonably expect as far as new housing units within the forecast horizon, within that up to 2040, and came out with different numbers of housing units for different study areas, which these 4 orange areas are different targeted growth areas along the corridor where we expect these developments to occur. So we have that information, but it's highly generalized. So we might have 6, 8 different sites in each one of those areas that could develop, and it's not as easy as just saying, okay, let's just come up with our distribution assumptions. A small change in your assumptions is going to have a big effect on your outcome. So garbage in, garbage out. If we come up with some off the wall assumption that isn't really that great, and we come to find later that trips are distributing themselves differently, well, our recommendations from that study can change quite a bit. So trying to find a way to be more targeted with those trip distributions. The tool that I've been using here for both traffic impact analysis and for these kind of situations with corridor studies has been finding a proxy site. So if we have housing units in a given study area that are there today, you can do the same thing with a commercial site, a gas station, whatever it may be, but picking out a reasonably representative already developed area within your growth area and performing an origin destination analysis using that proxy site as a non-pass-through zone, and then setting up zones in the surrounding transportation network to understand how people are accessing that area. So in this example here, this is a housing development here. We have percentages on the right. Again, I don't typically use volumes straight from Streetlight in these kinds of instances. I'm just trying to get relative flows from those percentage changes between different origins and destinations. So I have a breakdown here between 7 or so locations, so I could see pretty clearly, okay, well, how many people are using our corridor to go to Harrisonburg? How many people are using it to head to Elkton? How many people are just leaving and not touching that corridor? So that information, we then, if we move to the next slide here, we're able to use and apply to our trip generation, our trips generated from those developments that our local planners had identified, and come up with basically a mapping of how those trips are going to distribute themselves from each of those 4 target study areas. So this is just to get in the weeds of this, but this is just a diagram showing we're able to see, like, okay, how many trips are coming in a given area and how many trips are coming out. So looking at it from a more generalized perspective at first, drilling in a little farther using our streetlight distributions specifically from certain roadways to come up with our changes to our turning movement counts at each specific study intersection. So we had 24 study intersections. We have lots of potential development, different areas. So breaking it down from our best proxy sites to how people are going to use a given area. One of our study areas, we have, I think, probably 8 different ways that people can get onto our study route, our corridor. So any new housing developments that have all those options as well. So understanding how, people are going to distribute themselves is pretty difficult without a tool like this. So this is the outcome, is a final set of turning movement counts for each of our intersections. So lessons learned here, be wary of differences between AM and PM distributions. They can be very different. So your assumptions for corridor studies, traffic impact analyses might need to look at those variations, and also look at both directions, both the site as an origin and as a destination, because again, it can be very different. And then, consider what are the difference between your proxy site and your proposed site. So what are some of the adjustments you might need to, in your assumptions, you might need to tweak in order to represent any differences between your proxy site and the actual site. Streetlight's been very helpful for this, and at pretty much every traffic study now we're pulling this out, and it's really taken a lot of the guesswork out of our distribution assumptions.